Naptown Tuner here. In this video, I'm going to be talking about all the ways I screwed up installing this Audi VW water pump. And I got to know exactly what I'm doing because sometimes I do these things helping people out that are local to the Indianapolis area. And very rarely, I don't really put my email address out there very much because I can't really filter through all the people that just want free advice. But sometimes I come across someone that they're stranded. Their vehicle is gushing out so much coolant that they track down my email address, naptowntuner@yahoo.com. And for instance, this guy, I was able to go to his apartment complex and put a water pump on his car because he would have had to get a tow to whatever shop, and then he'd have to find out whatever kind of shop is competent enough, call her, figure out what kind of part. Real quick, there's been like starters as well, like people have a no start, so I'll help them out, and hopefully most of the time if your vehicle is a no crank, no start, it's just a starter motor, and we're starting to see those more and more. I will get into more engines, and I'm gonna, like for instance, one of my next videos, I'll be tearing down this old 50-year-old chainsaw just for the fun of it. And we're gonna see what kind of engineering went into this thing. Like for instance, there's no safety on this, there's no chain brake. Back to the water pump. All the ways I've screwed up installing this water pump. First off, they leak really bad. Most of the time, you see how this gasket right here goes, there's, we have a modular type water pump. Both of the coolant hoses, inlet and outlet, go right here. This right here bolts to the block itself. It's shaft drive. Well, it's belt drive, but it's driven off the balance shaft. And so this will be on the intake side of the engine, directly below the intake manifold. And if it doesn't pop this plastic off right here, and this one broke on both sides. It was broken right here and it was broken right here. And you can see how the gasket is folded over on both the top and the side. Very rarely, I don't think I've ever seen one yet on this style engine, but a thermostat can go bad. And this is the traditional style thermostat still, which I like. The generation engine one newer than this does a really funky thermostat, and I made a video about that. It's like some kind of rotating, opening, closing, electromechanical motor deal. That's not for this video. This one, the water pump itself looks very similar to this. Some of the guys that have worked on this stuff for a long time, this will look familiar. This, like the old 1.8Ts, the belt drives, the water pump it's gonna be a little bit smaller, but it would look exactly like this. It would be driven by the timing belt, and then you'd have a little aluminum pump. Well, actually the original ones were plastic. I'm talking about the impeller on this case. But the upgrade on the 1.8Ts was to get a metal impeller. The housing has always been aluminum on the 1.8Ts. Now, the original, they know how to build good stuff, but they just choose not to. The original pump like this came originally on this 2012, did not have an aluminum face pump housing. This is just the pump face. It bolts on to this whole modular type deal. The thermostat, if you wanted to, but I really suggest don't do this. You could take off this flange right here, this bottom fitting, and replace just the thermostat underneath here. In one of my next videos, I'm going to be pulling out the thermostat and I'll show you that. I've already done water pump videos in the past, but people like this kind of stuff, and I'm just trying to get some videos out there. So I'm going to show you the difference between a 7.3 liter water pump and a 2 liter water pump. Look at the size of this big boy compared to this little girl. Look at the size of these hoses compared to the size of those hoses. I chipped this whenever I was removing it, no big deal. So I was going to talk about all the different ways I've screwed up installing this pump. Whenever I was taking this pump off, I just put the pry bar in here, because this is junk at this point. I just put the pry bar in here and I was trying to bust it loose, because you can have all the bolts out, but it'll still stick in these dowel pins right here. And these dowel, that brings me to the first thing that you can screw up when installing this pump. And I hate to admit it, but I knew a guy at the dealership that whenever he would put on brand new pumps, he would chop these little dowels out, and because it makes it a lot more difficult aligning it. And if you don't get it perfectly aligned in these dowel pins, then if you go bolting it in, you can snap the plastic housing. And I can't really personally remember ever doing that, because I always make sure that it's perfectly set in there. And most of the time, if I'm not sure, I never put, except my 20-minute water pump video, which that was embarrassing almost, but a lot of people have watched that. I just zipped it in, zipped it out with a power tool, and I put a used water pump on. A lot of my older videos, and I'm still improving, even this is gonna be junk in the future, but a lot of my older videos, I just threw stuff out there kind of for shock value and all this other kind of stuff, just because I'm trying to get myself out there, be controversial. I've got enough subscribers at this point to where I'm just trying to be a little bit more serious. Maybe in the future I'll do a little bit more comedy. It really all depends. I'm still feeling out the different videos. But back to the point, and I'm sorry for sidetracking so much, but deal with it, okay? You're getting valuable lessons here, so you can waste a couple minutes of your time. So you have to make sure that these dowel pins are lined up. If they're not perfectly lined up, then the bolts aren't going to go in right. And there is, if you look at the service manual or the instructions, it will say how to install this thing, but it's pretty much all the same stuff. You usually start like in the center and work your way out whenever you're tightening stuff down, and you do it in stages. You don't just put one bolt in and go all the way tight, and then put the next bolt in all the way tight. That is just, you haven't graduated preschool if you're bolting stuff in like that. So you pretty much want to just get all the bolts in started first. Just started, not even snug or tight or anything. Get them, make sure that all the bolts fit in the holes, and then you're gonna start like in the middle, kind of get it snug, maybe not even really snug, just kind of all the way in there, work your way around, and then maybe snug all the bolts all the way around, and then finally in like the second or third stage after getting it snug, you want to go around these bolts. Like, this is plastic, this is the water pump. You don't want to do this again. You don't want to break it. You don't want to snap some of this plastic off when you're installing it. This is like a $200+ pump, at least the one that I got from O'Reilly Auto Parts was. I typically like to get at least a name brand, like a Gates or a what's the other one? There's a couple of them on Rock Auto that I'll get, that Beck & Arnley. That's a German brand. I typically like to get that one. It's like $165, $170 plus tax and shipping. So you'll pay, the one I got from O'Reilly Auto Parts, yeah, it had a lifetime warranty. They had it in stock. It was a mile away from my house. I didn't have to order it and wait for it. If you go to the dealer, it's gonna cost like, tell me, $400? I can't remember. I haven't priced one in a long time, but dealer prices are crazy. So if I want dealer OEM parts, which I do agree with, most of the time I want dealer OEM parts, I won't buy it from the dealer. They got the extra markup. I'll go to trusted websites, and I don't even necessarily want to say, well, I don't want to necessarily advertise for one person over the other. But I'll say that a lot of the parts, if they're not dealer parts, because Audi doesn't make all these parts. I don't know exactly who makes every single part. Every once in a while you can buy a part and it will have the parts supplier's name stamped on it. That's not the case with every part, but they source their parts from all kinds of different people and sublet all this stuff out. But let's get back on track. So make sure your dowel pins are lined up, bolt it in evenly in multiple stages, and then your final stage will be your proper torque spec. If you really are not very well versed in tightening stuff, then you might want to get out your quarter drive torque wrench and check the manual and do everything by the book. So now let's get into, I don't really run into this issue either, but there's been a few times, well, you can pop these are little clips, these hoses clip in, So they've got these little spring clips that you pop out, and then whenever you pop the hose off or when you pop the clips off, you can lose them. They can fall into Narnia whenever you drop them. So and then that can screw up your whole day, because let's say you're on a mobile repair, or even if you're in a dealership setting, a lot of times you might not be able to source just the clip. And some of these clips, they have to come with the hose assembly. You can't, so that's something to just really be careful when you're popping these clips off. And the other thing is, when you pull this hose off, there's inside that quick connect hose, there's a rubber either O-ring or in front of the O-ring, there's actually and I could probably show you all this stuff, but there's a plastic fitting that holds the O-ring in. So sometimes that little angled plastic fitting can slide out a little bit, and sometimes the O-ring can pop out a little bit. You always want to inspect the hoses before you pop them back on. And pretty much the O-rings in the quick connect hoses have always been good, but that little that little plastic fitting, I don't want to edit this video, so I'm going to keep on going. That little plastic fitting in front of the O-ring has to sit perfectly flush in there, and if it slides out when you pop the hose off, then might not fit perfectly. You might tear the O-ring. O-rings are a big deal, and that leads us to these O-rings right here in this union fitting. This union fitting, there's a couple different kinds. One of them's like a white plastic, and this one's a black plastic. I tend to think the white ones are a little bit more brittle of a type of plastic, but anyway, these fittings right here, they go to the oil cooler. And the O-rings themselves can, typically it's just like any type of gasket. After it's been bolted down, the rubber gaskets are more forgiving, but like any kind of like head gasket or any kind of like crush gasket, after you crush it down, that's a one-time use. You have to replace it. And that should be how you feel about all gaskets. Now, if you were to bolt on this pump and then you had to take it back off, the rubber is gonna come back into shape and you can bolt it back on again, but not after it's been sitting on the car for a couple months or a couple years or more. After that, the gasket is flattened out, it's got heat cycles in it, it's not going to come back into shape. And another thing with these gaskets is, I buy the OEM rubber gaskets. I don't trust, if you're getting aftermarket pumps, I don't trust aftermarket rubber. I've seen it over and over, even somewhat recently. I put a aftermarket rear coolant outlet housing on someone's engine, and a year later, the O-ring got pitted. The fitting itself was perfectly fine, but the O-ring was garbage. So if nothing else, the rubber has to be superior. It has to be of OEM type quality. The gaskets, you always want to make sure you got good gaskets. Same thing goes with these little union fittings. You might pay $10, $15, I can't remember what they are, for a good OEM union. But guess what? If this union, if the rubber's not good, if it doesn't fit perfectly, if you go trying to put this pump in, what I've ran into before is you can snag this O-ring and you can pinch it and it'll bunch up. And I haven't really per se seen these things leak over time just sitting there, but they can easily get bunched up or pinched when you install them. Now, this O-ring that goes inside this coolant pipe that goes to the heater core, this can leak by itself. And everything could, I'm just telling you my experience. This one could leak by itself, but not severely. This usually just gets crust around it, and you always want to lube things up with a rubber safe lube before you install all your O-rings. If nothing else, put a little bit of straight coolant on it. 50-50 coolant, not so much. It's not really gonna, but if nothing else, if you have straight coolant, that's gonna be enough lubricity to slide your fittings in and not snag. So the belt, I suggest putting new belts on, but so far what I've seen, the belts have been robust. Like for instance, the pump I bought today, it did not come with a new belt. You have to make sure that you have a good high dollar. Most pumps are not going to come with a belt. You have to buy the belt separately. I have purchased a handful of belts. The belts that I got were Dayco belts. I went to PRI and I talked to the guys at the Dayco booth, and the guy that I talked to was 35 plus year mechanic, and he had his own independent shop, and really impressive guy. He took time with me to talk to me. We talked about how Dayco is making chains. He said he was going to send me a Dayco chain kit, and I think I got his card somewhere, but I'm supposed to email him. Maybe I'll get a Dayco chain, because that's one of the next timing chain kits that he's going to come out with for the 2.0T. We'll see. I have to email him about it. Back to the water pump story, and I've gone way off track way too many times on this video, so go ahead and give it a big old thumbs down. The other things that I've messed up on this pump, I was talking about the belt, is if you don't put a brand new belt on, then when you take this belt off and when you slide it back on, you can snag it on, and this has been a long time ago, I'm perfect on putting these belts on now, but you can snag it on these fins and you can tear it in to the original belt. And I've seen where someone else, a car that I sold to a buddy had something like this, and someone put the water pump on, they didn't change the belt, and the belt was cut halfway through. So that's just hackery. If you cut a belt or mess up a belt, you definitely can't still use it. They're prying it off with screwdrivers and pry bars and pushing it back on. There is a little finesse that you have to do to get this belt on, and usually when this thing is still loose without any bolts in it, I kind of work a little bit of room with the union and then slide the belt on with it all still loose, and then I bolt it in. I don't bolt it on and then try to push the belt on, but I've got other videos where I install this thing. So what else have I screwed up on this thing? The big one, and I'm glad you stuck to the end of the video, because the big one, the number one deal that I screw up with is this little coolant temp sensor that goes through here. And if I wanted to, I could go grab one to show you, but this little coolant temp sensor is held in one of three ways. On some of the pumps, there's a screw that holds it in. Well, first off, there's an O-ring inside here. You need to make sure that this O-ring is typically always good, even the used one. But most pumps, the one I got even from O'Reilly's, had an O-ring that came with it, at least for the coolant temp sensor. But it did not include this clip right here. This clip is the worst. Audi, what are you thinking with this clip? This clip is garbage. It's a really thin, springy plastic clip, and the moment you try to take it off and reuse it, it's been on there too long, especially in the cold. And I was out there in 30-degree temperatures swapping this coolant temp sensor because my new pump did not come with a coolant temp sensor. So I successfully got this clip off, but whenever I tried to put the new one in, I tried to spring it open and it snapped right here. So I had to drive all the way back home and get a new clip because it was the weekend, the dealer wasn't open. I knew I had one at home, but I didn't bring one with me like an idiot. And the best kind of clip is this one right here, this little C-clip, because this also still fits, and this one is going to be a lot more forgiving, but it's still plastic. They also make these in the metal variety, and I would suggest the metal one over everything. So it's either going to have like a little screw in there, it's going to have this type of clip, or the worst type of clip is this type of clip. And this type of clip you can screw up, because if you try to spring load it in there and get it in there, you might have like a little tiny hairline crack that you don't notice. And this has happened to me before. You know, like a week later or whatever, the coolant temp sensor pops out. And you really have to make sure that these little elbows, these little plastic fingers slide perfectly in these rails. If you can find a good pump that has the coolant temp sensor already bolted in it when you buy it new, it comes with a new coolant temp sensor, you just killed two birds with one stone with that, because you don't have to swap the old, you don't have to trust the old sensor A lot of times I would suggest we're just replacing this coolant temp sensor anyway, because then you don't have to go back in there in the same region, especially if you're working on a customer car. Let's say you change the water pump and then you get an issue with the coolant temp sensor in the future. They're gonna think that you pulled wires or you messed up the connector or something like that. There's always suspicion of some forms of kind in that kind of regional type thinking. So be very careful with this springy clip. If you're changing a water pump, make sure you have one of these, either this type of clip or this type of clip. Make sure you have an extra clip. I suggest putting a new one on anyway, just for good measure, and if you can, try to stay away from this piece of garbage and tell Audi that they're idiots for using this. I don't know why they would. And the bolt-in type sensor is the best type of sensor. I mean, come on, why didn't you just stick with that? So, is there anything else that I can screw up installing this pump? You got to bolt it in right, you got to get a good union fitting, you got to get the belt on right, you got to make sure that this O-ring right here for your crossover pipe. I have been known to make sure, if you don't have an O-ring for this, because I have been known to put a little bit of quality silicone on there, but typically, typically you're supposed to let it set up a little bit. So that's might not be, they have the 1 minute stuff, the 90-minute stuff, and like the 24-hour stuff. I asked the guys at the PRI booth at this performance racing industry stuff, and some of the people were extremely knowledgeable and they knew everything about their brand. The guy I was talking to at Permatex, he didn't really know much more than what the package said. So, and a lot of people didn't really want to be on film because, they're just employees. They don't really benefit from putting themselves on YouTube and possibly making themselves look silly. But the guys that did the few videos that I did put out, I really appreciate those guys spending time with me, and they went above and beyond to put themselves on my YouTube video. So those people should get a raise, in my opinion. And if you get an aftermarket pump or whatever kind of pump, I would suggest at least trying to find one with aluminum housing for the pump itself. Even though this part right here is usually fine, the pump itself doesn't usually go bad. Now this one's a really old pump and it still feels, there's just a little bit of resistance to it, and that's what it should feel like. It shouldn't feel just like super loose. And this pump housing is basically brand new, and this one feels a lot tighter. This one feels real kind of tight compared to this used one. This one's been on the car for 10 years, 80,000 miles, but I've felt them to where they're like super loose. And it really all depends on the type of pump. Let's feel this 7.3 liter. This one's brand new. Let's see how, yeah, this one feels nice as well. I don't know how to, it's got like a half a foot-pound of resistance on it or something. It shouldn't just be like loosey-goosey. Okay? And is there anything that I'm missing with telling you about this thing? I really don't think so. Just make sure, oh yes, one more thing. There's two small bolts. There's one that's gonna be over here on the block that you take out, and this other one right here. But this one right here, this is just a knurled fitting below this crossover tube that goes to the heater core. This is just a small knurled fitting. And the first water pump that I ever installed many moons ago, I did put a longer bolt in this one right here. I wasn't near as organized. Now I have all kinds of little trays and stuff like that, and I have divider bins, and I make sure that I put all my bolts in order and everything goes back exactly where it came from. But I wasn't so organized in the past, and I put a slightly longer bolt in that fitting right there. I bottomed that bolt out too far, and it cracked this housing, and I had a leak. So you have to make sure that you put the correct same size bolts back in every single hole, and everything feels nice and is properly torqued. If any bolt feels like it's going in too tight, you need to back it out, back all the bolts out, readjust the pump. You have to be very careful with your bolt torque, especially on plastic parts. All right, if you like the video, hit the like and subscribe, help me out so I can pay my mortgage. All right.